Before we get to answering the question of how good was Francis Ngannou actually, it's important to ask how good he actually is, and perhaps more importantly, how good could he be? Since the early days of the UFC, and indeed fighting and boxing in general, there's always been an inherent fascination with the big men. There's something different about the electricity in the air when the chances of one punch or kick ending the night are so high. Perhaps the chances of that have never been higher than when Francis Ngannou steps into the octagon. Because MMA is such a relatively new sport, to find parallels, one must look to its closest cousin, boxing. In the 1970s, it was Foreman, with his fearsome physique and punching power. The 80s, and to some extent the 90s, belonged absolutely to Iron Mike Tyson. All precocious talent, singular rage, and scary power. For a brief time, it seemed that Deontay Wilder had it, but that disappeared when another Tyson, Fury this time, dismantled him and exposed him as one-dimensional and arguably undersized. The title of baddest man on the planet has a rich pedigree. In the realms of MMA, there have been many big men: Bob Sapp, Alistair Overeem, particularly in his Ubereem phase, Brock Lesnar, and countless others. All of these men had scary power and imposing physiques. Some were obviously more skilled than others. Sapp was essentially a blown-up football player dabbling in MMA, while Overeem was and is a legitimate kickboxing phenom, and Lesnar had a solid wrestling background. There was always something different about Ngannou, something more mysterious, something more raw, something scarier. Ask a casual fan or MMA newcomer to envision or design a heavyweight UFC fighter, and the chances are they're picturing Ngannou. Tall frame, massive, almost superhuman muscles, and intense stare. Words like monster, scary, and freak are never far away.
That picture seems like the coming of the new king. You know what I mean? Like, obviously he's got to beat Stipe Miocic, but if you want to like look at a picture like in history when you come back and go, this is the moment where Ngannou arrived.
It's impossible at this point not to bring up that punch. In a sport where the knockout is king, it takes something special to really stand out. Ngannou's knockout of Alistair Overeem at UFC 218 was absolutely savage in its execution, all raw power and angles. At this point in time, Alistair Overeem was the legitimate #1 heavyweight contender. He'd lost to the champ after having Stipe in all sorts of trouble at UFC 203 and bounced back with solid wins over Mark Hunt and Fabricio Werdum. At this point, and indeed at no point in time including now, could Alistair Overeem be described as anything other than a stud. There are few more iconic shots in MMA than that of Overeem's arcing body flying through the air, head snapped back at a sickening angle, and Ngannou's uppercut hook hybrid already in its follow-through. What Ngannou did to Overeem was scary not just because of what he did, but who he did it to. People will say that by this time Alistair had lost his chin, which may to some extent be true. However, this would likely have led him to adopt a more cautious and defensive style, thus making the punch even more impressive. Overeem's performances since that fight give credence to this theory. Plus, let's face it, that punch would have knocked out 100% of the people on Earth. Francis Ngannou was born on September 5, 1986 in Batié, Cameroon. To say that poverty is a part of his story is an understatement. By the age of 12, he was sent to work in a sand quarry, and after years of being approached by local street gangs to join them and refusing, he formally took up boxing at 22. At age 26, he moved to Paris and really began to take boxing seriously. However, legal problems and a spell of homelessness put paid to his ambition temporarily. A chance meeting with an MMA coach saw the young fighter switch codes from boxing to MMA.
The best time in my life because that was the first time that I felt like I had the opportunity to do something. It might be difficult to be homeless, but for me, I was, no, I'm good. This is the best moment in my life because I'm here. I got my opportunity. I'm gonna do things by myself, and I'm gonna do it very well. And that was like sometimes, you might think that you might thought that this would be the heaven, but this is not the heaven. I say, I know. I'm not looking to some heaven. I know that I'm gonna make my own heaven. I'm gonna build my own by myself.
Talking about Ngannou's upbringing and origins isn't just an exercise in relaying information from Wikipedia to you. More than maybe any other fighter, the circumstances of Ngannou's story add to his legendary aura. This is a man who didn't really take up MMA until 26 years old. His past as a homeless man, his working in the sand quarries of Cameroon as a young boy, and only taking up MMA late into his 20s all sound like the opening scenes of a movie. In some ways, they are. Ngannou's country and continent of birth also play a huge part in his aura. Just like the man himself, Africa is itself such a vast, powerful, and mysterious place. It's impossible to separate the man from his heritage when it comes to discussing Ngannou as a whole.
I've been through a lot. I've been through hell. It was clear. For me, it was set that I'm going to become a world class.
So how good was he? Well, up until he lost a decision to Stipe Miocic at UFC 220 on January 20th, 2018, the answer was very. But the question of how good he was always came with a caveat. How good could he be? To watch Ngannou's first few UFC fights is to watch a young man clearly learning a new trade on the job. His swings were wild, his technique rudimentary. His footwork was certainly of the plodding variety, and he seemed to have no ground game to speak of. What he had, though, was something that all heavyweights dream of: absolute destruction in his fists and an air of unparalleled menace. His power is truly something to behold. Take, for example, perhaps one of his more low-key recent knockouts, that of Jairzinho Rozenstruik in their rearranged bout on May 9th, 2020. The actual punch that knocked Rozenstruik out cold was fairly innocuous by Ngannou's standards, a short left at close range. But Rozenstruik, a 6'2", 250-pound monster in his own right, was left completely unconscious against the cage. This was a man with a fearsome 78-8 kickboxing record, and up until then was unbeaten in the UFC. In fact, the entire fight and sequence that ended Rozenstruik is almost like Ngannou's entire UFC career in a nutshell. Wild swings, big misses, a clearly frightened opponent, and a savage knockout, all in 20 seconds.
I mean, when I heard he called me out, I knew that he didn't know what he's doing. You know, he's not ready for. I mean, he has a lot of potential, obviously, but I think he has to take a step back and then get ready before fight against someone like me.
Maybe to truly get to the bottom of the question of how good Francis Ngannou was, we need to look at his two losses. Both losses came back-to-back and were for very different reasons. The Derrick Lewis fight, even now, almost seems like an anomaly. Both fighters have since gone on to much better performances, and both fighters fought very uncharacteristic fights that night. Having come off the loss to Stipe, Ngannou in particular seemed gun-shy. So then, we come to that Stipe fight on January 18th, 2018 at UFC 220. The hype around Ngannou, especially after that knockout of Overeem, had reached fever pitch. He was the bookies' and most people's favorite. For one round, he gave Stipe absolute hell, but the seasoned veteran withstood the initial onslaught and brought the fight to the mat. It was one-way traffic from there. Stipe did what he had to do in the face of such a fearsome puncher. He took away the option of that punch as soon as he could. While Ngannou lost that fight, the caveats to that loss, his relative inexperience and his fight-on-fight improvements, meant that he didn't really lose all that much momentum. The preceding fight with Lewis did a little more, but still, there were legitimate factors in that loss and he was never in trouble in that fight. Since those fights, Ngannou has been imperious. 4 fights, 3 performance of the nights, 2 ex-champs, and 2 minutes and 42 seconds for all 4 contests. There's the feeling that he's building towards something, frustrated by the fact that his conqueror and current champ Stipe Miocic is getting older, more susceptible to injury, and had to settle his grudge match with Daniel Cormier before even looking at the contenders to his crown. This time, so they say, it will be different. Ngannou has ironed out some of the rookie flaws in his game from when they first met. Stipe has even more miles on the clock and a couple of bruising encounters with DC. Despite the fairly unanimous first fight, the rematch was always inevitable. The question of how good Francis Ngannou was actually is about to be answered in real time, and may be about to change into how great is Francis Ngannou.